My name is P.S. Berkey. I use they, them pronouns. Thanks so much for having me. Today, I am super excited to share my talk, but first we need to talk about parallel universes, vectorizing trans power in video games. So this project is a part of my ongoing research trajectory that explores trans power fantasies. Game scholarship has given us a sense of what queer play looks like in video games, but what does trans play look like? So in this case study, we are going to look specifically at challenge running, and appropriate to the theme, I'm going to be making this a bit of a speed run. I think I have it timed out to 15 minutes, but we'll see. So I'm going to give you, to start out, a brief overview of challenge running and talk about how challenge running out of bounds are established notions in queer game studies. Oops. So to get started, challenge running, for the unfamiliar, is beating a game or part of a game with imposed conditions. Sometimes games develop their own emergent challenges, like the Minecraft Skyblock Challenge. Other challenge runs include physical constraints, like beating the game blindfolded or with your feet, or a Guitar Hero controller or a dance pad. Perhaps the most classic are hitless runs, which involve taking no damage or not dying. And finally, the most known of these are, of course, speed runs, which include the obvious condition beat the game fast. So speed runs mute that, often feature additional restrictions imposed on them by category. For example, while any percent speedruns focus on just beating the game, 100% categories require you to find all collectibles. And speedrunners train sometimes for years to optimize their runs, which they then share on public leaderboards such as speedrun.com. Speedruns are also characterized by all kinds of glitches and warps and what we call tech, uses and abuses of the game system that make runs easier. And finally, speedrunning is extremely community based, both in terms of influencer culture, but also dedicated forums and communities on Discord. And this is something that people don't always seem to know about speedrunning subcommunities, and that's that they are super queer and super trans. And if you don't believe me, I am going to let somebody I know you trust and respect explain it to you, Shadow the Hedgehog. Oops. Sorry. Gosh, there we go. Oh my gosh. We're going to rewind 5 seconds. Apologies. Okay. For context, this is one of my favorite videos on the internet. And Shadow's dialogue is actually taken from a very real, very earnest Twitter rant about leftists and queers taking over speedrunning. And here's the weird thing. In a twisted way, Shadow is a little bit right. Queer game scholars have talked about the ways that speedrunning can and does engage queer play. Sorry, alternative sexual archetypes. Um, and we associate queerness in games with disorienting normative trajectories, to invoke Sarah Ahmed. Game scholars have explored this in key places. Whit Pao and Edmund Chang discuss the history of transness and queerness and glitches. Edmund Chang and Alexander Galloway have talked about countergaming and counterplay. And Bo Ruberg and others have talked about walking, exploration, and queer movement in games like Octodad. And speedrunning engages all of these. But this is where we run into a problem with how we approach queerness in gaming more broadly. We associate queer play with non-normative play, disorientation, and misalignment, but challenge running doesn't fit neatly here. For example, Bo Ruberg has argued that speedrunning God Home takes an inherently queer exploratory game and straightens it by reducing it to rail-like paths. As they write, talking about speedrunning as an enactment of straightness, far from being an interpretation imposed on speedrunning from the outside, comes directly from the discourse of the speedrunning community itself. Straightness is a prominent feature in the language that speedrunners use to discuss Gone Home. But Rubric recognizes that this is an oversimplification, and they go on to note that speedrunners resist the chrononormativity of video games in their own way, rejecting the pace at which games are meant to be played and instead racing through them at top speed. They also often use glitches to jump between game areas or gain other advantages, which resonates with writing by Edmund Chang and Halberstam on the queer potential of glitches in video games. But Ruberg walks us right up to this idea and doesn't quite take us there. And here we can see firsthand the failure of queer and feminist game studies. Feminist scholars like Amanda Cody have argued that play that centers mastery and dominance celebrates six masculine power fantasies, but that's too simple here. And similarly, queer game studies ends up performing this weird inventory of speedrunning, tallying up all the ways in which it feels normative and the ways it doesn't, like weighing a list of sins. And this tension is indicative of a bigger scholarly and cultural shift happening right now in game studies, and that's the emergence of trans game studies, a subfield that is, at times, incongruous with queer and feminist scholarship. TJ Billard and Ari Zhang talk about this brilliantly when they write, queer theorists often interpret transness either as some ultimate form of queerness that manifests literally in the metaphor of gender transgression, or as an anti-queer impulse toward binary conformity. This is where this tension comes from. Does speedrunning straighten play? Well, maybe if it's glitchy enough, we can call it queer, right? But they go on to note that trans identity disrupts this theoretical model, as trans people variously identify with and against a binary gender system in a complex field of valid identities. Accordingly, transgender media representations cannot be simply read through the queer political fantasy of counternormativity. And this is a crucial point, and one that really resonates with me as a non binary and trans feminine person. There are certainly ways in which I disavow normative gender structures, but I also embrace other structures, like eyeshadow palettes and purses and perfumes. And so, how do we understand this in the context of challenge runs? Challenge running has broken queer game studies because it can be at once aligned with what we might call normative play, and it can also be radically subversive. Looking at speedrunning categories as an example, we might say that Elden Ring any percent speedruns recenter familiar modes of play. Beat the game, beat it fast, kill the bosses. But on the other hand, speedrunning categories can also be subversive. For example, the Super Mario Odyssey nipple percent category, in which runners try to remove Mario's shirt as quickly as possible. Or my personal favorite, Breath of the Wild's Butter Dog Dog with the butter on him category, where runners race to put butter on the dog. So, to quote Madison Schmalzer, a speedrunner herself and currently writing her dissertation on transness and speedrunning, because she said it best, that's speedrunning. It's about indexing desires. Speedrunning indexes a community's desire to perform certain kinds of play. All of these runs are ways of indexing desire the way you want to play, whether it's 100%ing the game or putting butter on a dog. Okay, we're not quite done with Mario, but we are done with shirtless Mario. I want to now quickly talk about how challenge running and the vectorized body can be put into the context of trans power. And to do this, we're going to look at a game very dear to me, Super Mario 64. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Super Mario 64 A button challenge, which involves beating the game while pressing the A button as few times as technically possible. Challenge running legend Pan and Koek 2012 released a video in 2016 in which he guides potential runners through the process of beating a single level of Super Mario 64 in only half an A press. In his guide, Panin discusses how Mario's position is processed by the game's logic. Because of how Mario's position is stored, it is possible to confuse the game about where Mario is standing. If Mario warps far beyond the boundaries of the map, the game's collision logic will wrap around, thinking he is still standing on the original map. Pannon explains that it becomes possible then to imagine a world of invisible collision detection meshes beyond the boundaries of the map that he calls parallel universes. Mario's physical position, which the game checks for collision, and his actual position then become separated. His collision detection continues to navigate the original map, while actual Mario bounces between distant parallel universes. Pannon then describes a detailed process by which he builds up speed using a movement glitch. He locks Mario under a ceiling and holds the thumbstick to continue building up speed, which he proceeds to do for over 12 hours. Then, by calculating the relative incline of various slopes on the map, he initiates a complex series of movements that launch Mario across an entire grid of parallel universes until he eventually resyncs Mario's physical and actual positions just in time for him to collect the level's final star, all the while never once pressing the A button. Just to give you a glimpse of what this looks like, I'm going to show you the culminating moment of what is, again, an entire day's worth of effort, a single level of the A button challenge. It is beautiful. You should watch the full video. Um, but challenge runs center refusal. And they do this by saying, I would rather spend an entire day launching my gamic body through invisible parallel universes than press that fucking A button. And so at the same time, this refusal is not a loss. It foregrounds the creation of new power. When we refuse to jump, we unlock the power to travel through parallel universes, building impossible speed. We uncover hidden rules, tech, and new possibilities for the vectorized body. When you watch Pannon's video, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by the science and the art of this new kind of movement. Challenge runners must know the rules of the game better than even the people who built them. And so, what can challenge running teach us about trans game studies and trans theory? What does it mean to vectorize trans power? This connects to something Misha Cardenas calls the shift, which is useful for thinking about vectors. As she writes, the intertextuality of the trans body may come from the way that it can reflect different narratives over time, the way that shifting from one narrative about the body to another opens up a network of meanings. Where queer theory tries to moralize things on a spectrum of normativity, trans theory suggests that the body can, at once, reflect many narratives, shifting narratives, and meaning. She goes on to note that players and characters in processes of shifting are temporarily stitched together by algorithms that enable poetics to crackle loudly or ripple gently across the space between bodies in motion. In other words, it is the very movement, the motion itself, in which we can find poetic resonance. It is also, I argue, where we find trans power. Given what I've described, we can understand trans power as it manifests in challenge running, the ability to create through refusal. Challenge runs show us that by embracing constraint, by refusing expectations of play, we set the terms of our own runs. So with this in mind, let's reset the timer and come back to vectors. We shy away from quantification in queer game studies, but whether it's tracking my hormone values or calculating the time it will take me to get through TSA, I am continually reminded that trans bodies and their movement are already procedurally and mathematically computed. And these vectors we've been describing are not individual. Challenge runners are constantly sharing strategies, building detailed guides, uncovering and sharing tech with one another. These are communal paths, indexing the labor and desire of entire communities of play. And so by embracing the body as vector, we can see trans power enacted through direction as desire and force through the grind. Fast or slow, subversive or familiar, all runs are a celebration of movement towards becoming and of doing it because we fucking want to. So to wrap up, speedrun scholars often focus on the optimization, but this misses the point. If anything, speedrunning is about the grind, the knowledge, the community, and the mastery over the self and the ludotechnical assemblage. Whether that's by yeeting yourself across the map and making bosses fall through the floor in Elden Ring, or, and this video is not loading, so I'm going to pull it up here, um, or watching Link stare at a rupee for 17 uninterrupted hours so that he glitches through the wall behind him. We decide how we get there. We don't make the rules, but we do choose the run, the route, the tech, and the game. And that's trans as hell. I hope we might all continue to out of bounds queer theory in exciting new ways and explore vectors and bodies. Thanks so much.